Hello, everybody. I'll let people just kind of get in and get settled. As well, back in the good old days when we used to meet face to face and we were all getting settled in and having little chats as we come into the physical spaces. Not quite the same when we're doing it online, but lovely to see you all coming in. I'm Sharon Friel. I'm a Professor of Health Equity and I head up the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, the hosts for this Saving the World webinar series. I come to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I want to acknowledge these are unceded lands and, of course, to pay respects to elders past, present, and future, and to acknowledge any First Nations people joining us online. And, of course, for many of you across Australia, you are also coming from a whole variety of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. So really delighted today. So as you know, in the Saving the World webinar series, we love to take on these big thorny issues of what's been driving the consumptogenic system, what's some of the ways out of this consumptogenic system that is causing planetary health inequities. Some of that's to do with economics, some of it's to do with energy, some of it's to do with food systems. And there's a whole load, of course, of other things that is very, very relevant for this issue of planetary health equity. And really delighted today to be joined by Dr. Anja Bless. Anja is a lecturer in, sustainability and international relations at UTS. She's also one of the editors of the forthcoming book on planetary health equity, getting out of this consumptogenic system and saving the world. So that's a wee plug for hopefully the book coming out from all of us, all of the participants in the Future Leaders programme that'll be coming out next year. But Anja does lovely work in environmental politics, food politics, really trying to understand agri-food systems transformation and all of these big structural drivers that are central to that question. So really delighted to have you join us, Anja. Can't wait to hear about what I think is going to be a very, very thought-provoking talk. So over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. And hello to everyone. I'm going to quickly share my screen. And Amy or Sharon will flag to me if that isn't working, but we tested it earlier, so hopefully it's all
Perfect.
good.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. So thank you for having me. Sharon's already done a wonderful job of introducing me, so I won't bother with that too much, but I do want to acknowledge country. So I'm joining from the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. I would like to acknowledge their ancestors past and present, or elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded, that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So the title for today's talk is Painting the Pastures Green, Corporate Co-optation of Regenerative Agriculture. And this is largely based on a paper of a very similar title, and I'll share a reference to that at the end, looking at corporate involvement in the regenerative agriculture movement. And this emerged from my PhD studies with the Institute for Sustainable Futures, which the thesis for that was titled The Politics of Regenerative Agriculture, Looking Beyond the Farm Gate, and it explored the regenerative agriculture movement in both Australia and at the global scale. So this research was a result of that global scale analysis. So what I'm going to focus on today is starting off with the rise of regenerative agriculture. I assume many of you here who've joined are here because you know something about regenerative agriculture or are interested in it, but for the sake of those who may not know as much or are wanting to learn more, I'll do a brief sort of overview of what it is and how it's sort of come about. I'll then outline how corporations have demonstrated their interest or involvement in the movement before going into, and I apologize, this will be the slightly academic part where I'm going to sort of outline the way in which I analyze how these corporations involved themselves in the movement through what's called a 3 faces of power framework. And I'll come closer to that. I'll explain that when we're a bit closer. But essentially, that's my political scientist hat coming on, where I see power and conflict and contention everywhere. Then this research was done a couple of years ago, and so I've got a brief refresher on basically where we are now and sort of what's happening now in terms of the corporate action in regenerative agriculture. And then I'm going to end on a brief discussion on the way in which the corporate co-optation of regenerative agriculture, as I'll argue it, is what I would describe as regenerating or resonating with an existing what we call food regime. So the sort of structures of the current agri-food system and the way it's reinforcing those structures. And then I know Sharon always likes to go, all right, what do we do about it? So we're going to end then on a more positive note of what can be done for those who are in the regenerative agriculture space, if you're in policy making or if you're a consumer or an interested party. So we should all know this, but just so we're aware, I'm going to depress you for a couple of slides. So why do we care about agriculture? Well, the current industrial agriculture system, so that's agriculture that is produced or conducted at a mass scale using machinery, less humans, monocultures, all the sort of big bad things you see on these documentaries or in the news. So it is unsustainable. And why is it unsustainable? Well, 70% of the world's agro-biodiversity has been lost. Often we hear about biodiversity in terms of our natural or local environments, but agro-biodiversity is the crops and the types of foods that we grow and consume. So that diversity of those crops and plants and animals is slowly depleting over time, or quite rapidly depleting now. 1/3 of the world's agricultural land is also severely degraded, and soil takes a long time to recuperate. So we're losing soil and therefore losing productive land. Our biogeochemical flows are at high risk of exceeding planetary boundaries. This means we have excess nitrogen and phosphorus use, and we're exceeding the planet's capacity to recycle and regenerate those systems. And 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So it's impacting across all what we call the planetary crises of pollution, of biodiversity loss, and of climate change. But there's also the other end of the spectrum, where 25% of food that we grow is wasted. 50% of what we're eating in places like the UK, the US, and also Australia comes from ultra-processed foods that are unhealthy for us, that aren't satiating, that make often our health worse. Meanwhile, even though we're producing more food than ever before, 2.83 billion people can't afford a healthy diet. And then another interesting aspect of what's happening in the food system is that more and more people are moving into urban areas, which means there are less people working on the land and engaged in the food system. So these are all big challenges, and there's this growing series of solutions that have been appearing since the 1960s or earlier that are proposing different ways to address these problems, particularly when it comes to agricultural production. And so you have things like these terms you may have heard of before: organic agriculture, there's agroecology, sustainable intensification, conservation agriculture. And the most recent one to really emerge and take prominence is regenerative agriculture. So we see across news, across media, from nonprofits, international organizations, government institutions, politicians, and also from farmers themselves, this chatter and talk about regenerative agriculture. And this really emerged in the last I would say, 8 or so years. So the term regenerative agriculture was coined by Robert Rodale, who ran an organic agriculture institute in the United States. And so they were talking about regenerative organics, so organic farming that also works to regenerate ecosystems. But it really fell out of fashion up until around this 2017, 2018 mark. And these graphs just basically show these sort of spikes in interest in news media, in literature, and also in academic research around that time. And then in Australia specifically, we have what I like to call the Charlie Massey effect. which is Dr. Charles Massey wrote the book called The Reed Warbler, all about regenerative agriculture, and it was a huge hit in Australia. It was released in 2018, and you can see from the Google searches and news mentions of regenerative agriculture, particularly in Australia, that seemed to be one of our catalyst points for interest at the Australian level. And so here are some quotes from farmers and policymakers essentially pointing out that no one was talking about this thing until suddenly everyone was talking about this thing. And that's where my interest really peaked in looking at regenerative agriculture in terms of why has this emerged in this way. So what is it? It is defined in many ways, but generally it's agriculture that utilizes practices such as the integration of livestock in mixed systems, no or low external inputs, maximizing soil cover, and no or low tillage. And often it's framed in terms of the outcomes it produces rather than the practices that it uses, so that it's agriculture that aims to improve soil health, increase biodiversity, sequester carbon into the soil and into vegetation, improving water resources. And sometimes it's also framed in terms of how it can improve the social economic well-being of communities and farmers, though that definition is less common. So this term emerges or re-emerges around 2017, 2018, and it doesn't take very long for large corporations and companies and startups to emerge that are very interested in it. So this graph on the right in particular is useful to see. It's a bit confusing because it goes from right is the furthest time away to left, which is a more recent time in 2019. And the scale shows the top is companies that have more than $100 million and then sort of goes down. And basically you can see that same pattern of from around 2016, 2017, 2018, this increasing business interest in regenerative agriculture. And this is something that really spiked my interest as a researcher, is sort of what's going on here. So in terms of what's going on, what was happening around that time? Well, in 2015, we had COP21 and the global climate agreement at Paris, where policymakers agreed to net zero to reduce emissions so that we could keep warming within ideally 1.5 degrees. We also have a lot of news and media around that time around the climate impacts of agriculture. The awareness is increasing. There's a lot of push, for instance, to reduce meat consumption. So this is sort of culminating at the same time. Then in 2017, the UN produces its first ever edition of the Global Land Outlook, which is where you get that statistic of 1/3 of global agricultural land is degraded. So essentially there's this big call out highlighting not only the climate impacts of agriculture, but also that our actual soil health is unsustainable, that soil degradation is occurring at a rate that will cause huge food security risks down the line. Another interesting thing that happens around this time is around the 2020, 2021 mark, you start to see this increasing pressure on companies to disclose their climate and environmental impacts through what are called sustainability disclosures in their annual reporting in order to participate in certain stock markets and other capital markets. And this occurs in some places in the US, but is nationalized briefly. It happens in the EU, happens in places like Australia as well. And so these companies are suddenly under a lot of pressure, not only to show how they're aligning with these global climate agreements, that they're aware that agriculture is unsustainable and that will have impacts on their own supply chains, but also they're under this pressure to disclose and show that they're doing something for Earth and sustainability. And you also, in terms of biodiversity, around 2023, have a number of companies and conservation organizations come out with the nature positive commitment that they want to be halt or reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 from a 2020 baseline. So there is this sort of big shift from 2015 onwards, where you see this big push around agriculture being more sustainable with a strong emphasis on carbon emissions, biodiversity loss, but also in particular soil. So this is just interesting context to understand where these companies are coming from. So in amongst all of this, I decided to have a look at what I would deem the most powerful organizations to understand who had regenerative agriculture programs or policies to understand what they're doing and what their potential influence or impact will be on the movement due to having these programs. So I looked at any company that was multinational, so functioning in more than one country, had an annual revenue of over US $10 billion, had an active regenerative agriculture program or policy at the time that I was researching, which was between 2021 and 2023, and was an agri-food company. So I wasn't looking at finance organizations or other startups that may be sort of adjacent to this sort of broader movement. And what I came up with was these 21 companies, which are some of the most, I would say, infamous multinational corporations. You have companies like Amazon and Walmart, but also Cargill and JBS, major meat processors and supply chain actors, Nestle, PepsiCo, Mars, Mondelez, McDonald's, so ultra-processed food manufacturers, Bayer, Syngenta, Yara, who are all agri-chemical companies. So not your usual suspects or ones that would pop into your mind when you think about regenerative agriculture. But overall, there was definitely a movement in some of the most powerful places in corporate agri-food, the corporate agri-food regime, that there was an interest in regen ag, and that was something that I wanted to investigate. So the way that I investigated it was through what's called the three faces of power. I wanted to understand the instrumental power that these corporations were wielding or sort of enacting as in the movement. So that means the power over something. So the way that they can make an actor do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And often this manifests in monetary power. So you have a lot of power if you have a lot of money. I was also interested in this structural power. So this is the ways that they set the agenda for their supply chain. So they may not force someone to do something by sort of, paying or lobbying, but they might instead say, here are our targets and here are our plans, and we expect you to somehow align with them due to the fact that we are dominating our particular supply chains. And then the final type of power I looked at was discursive power, how they shape the ideas and the ways that we talk about something. So they sort of create the world that they want to manifest. So in terms of instrumental power, well, they are very, very rich. So they already have a lot of instrumental power by virtue of just having an extreme amount of wealth. These 21 companies just combined have an equivalent revenue, this was in 2020, of $1.646 trillion, which is the equivalent of 1.9% of global GDP. So they are wealthier than many, many countries around the world. So a huge amount of that power capacity. But not only that, they're invoking that capacity. So these companies together had invested or just aimed to invest over $3.9 billion in regenerative agriculture programs. And this far exceeds any comparable government or other industry program that I was able to see. So huge investments. And the biggest spenders being Syngenta, which is an agri-chemical company, Nestle, who we all know, PepsiCo, Unilever, and JBS. So what were they doing? Well, Syngenta committed to a $2 billion target investment for its Good Growth Plan, which aims to increase agricultural productivity in a sustainable and responsible way to advance regenerative agriculture. It's likely, I think, that this was a lot of pressure due to the emissions that are coming from the fertilizers that they produce. And so the desire to figure out ways that they can still be relevant and maintain their relevance as a company in light of the pressure to reduce agriculture emissions, many of which come from the fertilizers that this company produces. Another company was JBS, who's pledged to invest $100 million by 2030 in research around scaling regenerative farming practices as part of its net zero pledge. Spoiler alert, they've actually dropped this net zero pledge. So this comes from a lot of the claims that are out there around the capacity for regenerative agriculture to sequester or absorb carbon into the soil and negate emissions from livestock, for instance. So JBS is a major livestock producer. So JBS is essentially hoping that through regenerative practices, it can reach net zero by sequestering carbon into the soil. Unfortunately, the science around the sort of permanency or the longevity of that carbon in the soil is not really there. But this is something that JBS was very keen to sort of promote. And PepsiCo and Walmart have been working together. So it's not just these companies working separately, which is interesting, but they also end up working together. So JBS and Walmart had a $120 million joint investment to support the uptake of regenerative agriculture across 2 million acres of farmland. A lot of this, you go, why is PepsiCo involved? They make Pepsi. PepsiCo owns most of the chips in the chip aisle. So this is all about potato growing and also corn growing. So what they want is for their potato farmers to help to absorb some carbon in their soil so that PepsiCo can meet their climate commitments. Because their aim, sorry, I have a stat here, their aim is to achieve 4 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions reductions and removal by 2030. So big numbers are their big aims. Another aspect of instrumental power is not just having the money or investing the money, it's also about lobbying. And so there's an example here of the CEO of Syngenta, so the agrochemical company, writing this op-ed calling for Joe Biden to support regenerative agriculture. There's been examples sort of across the spectrum of companies like Tyson and Cargill also pointing to the advantages of regenerative agriculture, promoting it to major governments. So what they want is government investment also to, again, support their own targets. What's interesting from Syngenta as well is that they have money to make here. One of the things that they're shifting more towards is digital and precision agriculture technologies. So using technologies that monitor and very precisely deliver fertilizer, pesticides and herbicides where they're needed along in a farm. And they're investing really, and they've signaled that they're investing more heavily in that as what they see as the future of their industry. So for them, the more farmers that want to reduce inputs by using their technology, the better. So there's also this sort of financial incentive in there for them. And it's similar case for Bayer and Yarra. So that's instrumental power. Structural power. Well, these companies have a lot of structural power. They essentially can, because they dominate so much of the food supply chain, whatever they say goes. JBS is the world's largest meat producer. Nestle is the largest food and beverage company in the world. Mars is the largest confectionery company. Almost 20% of global crop protection is delivered by Syngenta. Cargill is the largest private company in the United States. PepsiCo is the second largest food and beverage company in the world. 20% of the global agriculture input market for seeds and chemicals comes from Bayer. So they own this supply chain essentially. And what that means is when they set these targets that they're setting, as you can see here, it has implications along the supply chains that they control and manage. And the really clear example of that is Nestle. So Nestle, the largest food and beverage company in the world, has set a target for 50% of their key ingredients, quote unquote, to be produced through regenerative agriculture by 2030. And they were aiming for 20% of that to be achieved by 2025. Now, to do this, they had committed to, which is quite significant. So they committed $1.3 billion, again, a very significant commitment by 2025 to do this. Now, in terms of structure, Nestle has 500,000 producers in its supply chain and 150,000 suppliers. So that means by 2030, they expect 250,000 producers potentially to be doing whatever they say regenerative agriculture is. Now, is their investment enough to do this? Well, if you divided that $1.3 billion by the number of suppliers that they had, each supplier would end up with $2,600 each. Now, shifting to regenerative agriculture is not free. Sometimes you'll find that productivity decreases during that transition phase. The financial support that is being given by Nestle in theory here is not sufficient, but that's kind of a moot point when it comes to their structural power, because they get to set the agenda, and where else are those suppliers supposed to go when so much of the supply chain is dominated by this company? Another way that they invoke structural power is by essentially setting the way they work together. So there's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development that most of these companies are a part of, and then they set up a new initiative called One Planet Business for Biodiversity. And this, as part one of the key initiatives for this, was regenerative agriculture. So you can see how all these companies are also collaborating to say, we're going to join in on this phrase. This is working for us. Now, what's interesting here is they also have set up their own definition for what they think regenerative agriculture means and how they plan to measure it across their supply chains, disregarding what regenerative farmers at the grassroots level or non-profits might argue regenerative agriculture is. These companies who dominate these supply chains have set the agenda. And what this also means is they're invoking discursive power. So they're determining the ways in which something is thought about or discussed. So this is just a sort of quick overview of the different ways that the definitions of these companies of regenerative agriculture, because most of them don't actually produce a definition, they just use the term willy-nilly. The ones that do, this is how they align with that earlier sort of description I showed. And what you can see here is that basically none of them talk about reducing external inputs. So they're not talking about reducing chemicals in the supply chain. They are very keen on integrating livestock because, again, it's this idea of reducing or minimizing the impacts of red meat or livestock production. They're very keen on sequestering carbon because they want to hit their net zero commitments. But they're also very interested in these three aspects, which is maximizing soil cover, no or low tillage, and cover cropping. And this is sometimes called conservation agriculture, and it's a highly input intensive way of cropping in the way that you because traditionally you would till in order to remove weeds from a cropping system. If you don't till, then you need to use something like a broad spectrum herbicide to remove those weeds so that you can then crop what you need to crop and to avoid competition. So you can see why these companies they're not keen to reduce inputs because that means they couldn't maintain soil cover and increase their soil carbon. So also the ways in which they're selective about how they describe regenerative agriculture has implications along the supply chain as well. Some other examples of discursive power is what we call the halo effect. And what this means is companies that might be considered bad by the general public partner with those that are considered good so that they can absorb some of the halo of good from that organization. So pretty much all of these companies have some sort of arrangement, partnership with a environmental NGO. So the example here is a Nature Conservancy with Cargill, McDonald's and Target. WWF has partnered with PepsiCo and Danone. So it's also interesting to see the ways in which they're using these companies to help these organizations to help legitimize their programs as well. And it's also one of the main ways that some of these companies seem to be getting their money is through these programs, some of the environmental NGOs. Finally, another thing that they've been doing is running these conferences, these regenerative agriculture summits that they're key sponsors for. And they invite farmers along, sometimes policymakers, but essentially it's a way in which they can work together to coalesce their own discourse of how they're going to talk about something and promote themselves as sort of front runners of this particular idea. Now, these summits were running every year for a number of years. They were running in the US and Europe. But what's interesting, and this is where the danger is of this sort of corporate activity, is these summits have now ended. So this is a classic example of greenwashing activity by companies where they'll pick up a term when it's useful to them. And if it becomes problematic or people challenge them on it, or there's a new term that comes up, they very quickly will drop it. And this is an example of where are they now? So I was curious after all this research, I revisited Nestle to say, well, it's now past 2025. Did they hit their target? And well done to Nestle. They claim that they have sourced 27.6% of their key ingredients from regenerative agriculture practices. Well done. But what is interesting to notice is the phrasing has changed since when I collected this data in 2021. So they said originally key ingredients that were farmed using regenerative agriculture. Now it says from farmers adopting regenerative agriculture practices. And the way that they're doing this is they're measuring, they have a new framework that looks at these different levels of engagement in regenerative agriculture. So in order to count as part of their target, you just need to be engaged in regenerative agriculture. So for instance, in cropping, you need to have 30% of your cropland covered by for at least 10 months by something. Now, that's a threshold that I would say a lot of croppers can hit. But if you hit it, then you get to count as adopting regenerative agriculture for the purpose of Nestlé's targets. And when I looked into it, most of the farmers that they were claiming under this title seem to be in the engaged sort of adopting phase and not in this leading phase, which is the full implementation of regenerative agriculture. And it's not just me who's noticed this. A consultancy called FAIR has been monitoring these corporations' regenerative programs, and what they've found is when they did their analysis in 2030, there were 35% of the companies, 79 companies they analyzed had targets for regenerative agriculture. This has now fallen to 28% in 2026. And companies like Compass and JBS are no longer talking about regenerative agriculture, as same with Yum Brands, which encompasses, I believe, KFC. Only 4% of the companies that they've analyzed have set outcome-based targets. So actually looking at what happens, not just whether or not you're doing a practice, but what happens when you do the practice, even though 54% say they are measuring them. And 52% of these companies have talked about reducing agrochemical inputs, but they're still relying, as I've said, on these practices that rely on these herbicides. And not one company has set a target to reduce pesticide use. So again, talking the talk, not necessarily walking the walk. And as the example of JBS, they're also dropping these targets. So JBS, due to legal action, has dropped its net zero target because essentially the legal action said you can't prove that you're going to be able to reach it. And FAIR's analysis was that this is one of the problems for these companies, is that they're realizing that they need to be able to meet the claims that they're making. So they're very quick to drop the idea. So this kind of brings me into this idea of how it regenerates the regime. I won't go into this too much, but essentially over time, the global agri-food system has looked different. You had this sort of colonial regime for a time where food was being extracted from colonies, including Australia, to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the UK, and also increasingly the US. Eventually that shifts towards the US being the dominant power and exporting huge amounts of food into the global south and elsewhere up until the 1970s. And then more recently, there's a lot of debate about what does the regime look like now? And no one's been able to land on the exact title, but essentially everyone agrees that this corporate power and corporate dominance is sort of the key part, that these corporations are keen to maintain industrial agriculture and maintain their power and control over the food system at all costs. So is regenerative agriculture regenerating the regime, this corporate regime? Well, yes, the same companies that are key players, that have been key players in developing this industrial and extractivist agri-food system, are the ones that are promoting regenerative agriculture. You know, Cargill and JBS have concentrated animal feeding operations. Their mechanized input-intensive production is promoted by Bayer, Syngenta, Yara, and companies like Nestle, Unilever, Mondelez, Mars are all ultra-processed food producers that contribute to declines in health and plastic pollution. And this version that they're promoting of regenerative agriculture is essentially often conservation or precision agriculture, which is a way in which they can sell more or new different products for that particular type of farming. The challenge is that there's very little regulation or independent oversight of these initiatives. So these companies can make claims, set targets, and then drop them at the whim of at their own whim, without any real consequences. And the risk is that when they do that, there's a lot of burden that's put on farmers, particularly in the global south, where they're supposed to meet these targets, and then these targets are then neglected or dropped. And so the other challenge is as well that these companies being so loud about regenerative agriculture means that other potentially transformative movements like agroecology get lost in the noise. So the conclusions I have are that corporations have co-opted the regenerative agriculture movement, and they use it to legitimize their ongoing power and influence, to strengthen their position in the global agri-food system. They've used their instrumental power, their money, and their structural power, their dominance of supply chains to position themselves as key players in regenerative agriculture. And so this isn't just a greenwashing exercise, but it's also part of their broader efforts to consolidate their power or maintain their power in the global agri-food system. And what they're using it for is to open up new industries and economic opportunities for corporate concentration. And I could go into a whole other thing about carbon markets as an example of the way in which they're basically doing what companies do and finding new ways to make money. So, in my last 3 minutes, what do we do about it? Now, shifts to a regenerative system, which is what regenerative agriculture theoretically should be supporting, cannot be achieved through what I would describe as non-systemic efforts. So not efforts that also address the structures that maintain the unsustainable regime. And so by allowing companies to maintain the status quo and business as usual, we can't get to a regenerative system. And we essentially allow them to continue to perpetuate the harm that they've already caused. So what we need, first and foremost, is to treat these initiatives with a very healthy skepticism, is what I'm hoping to advocate for here, that we should be demanding transparency, accountability, and also that justice is central to any program that they put forward. Regenerative agriculture shouldn't just be about changing some practices on farm. It should also be considering the broader well-being of communities and the environment beyond the farm gate as well. So what can you do if you're a regenerative agriculture advocate? Well, I would recommend turning to other existing sustainable agriculture and food system movements, the organic agriculture movement, La Via Campesina, the Agroecology and Food Sovereignty Alliance here in Australia. And that's not to say drop the term regenerative agriculture, because it clearly has a lot of power, but instead work with those other organizations that have similar concerns, similar beliefs, similar values, to have a coalition of actors that collectively can challenge the power of these companies, because expecting individual farmers or individual retailers to do that is largely impossible given the scale of power that these companies have. If you're a policymaker, well, I would say definitely keep an eye on these corporate supply chain efforts, not just in regenerative agriculture, but elsewhere, because there's a real risk that farmers are going to have to bear the burden of costs when these initiatives come through. Woolies and Coles is a great example where they set these targets and then it cascades back through the supply chain with no support or funding from those very rich companies to implement the targets that they've set. So essentially they set the targets to make money from the greenwashing, while the farmers down the line have to bear the costs. A really clear way that we can address that is through stronger competition regulation and reducing corporate concentration in the supply chain. And that includes things in the processing sector, retail sector, and in the input sector, particularly the advisory services that they tend to produce or provide. Another thing that the public sector could do is support on-farm ecosystem regeneration through public money. So recognizing that farmers are stewards of public goods, our ecological systems. And so we could, for instance, compensate our farmers through payments for ecosystem services. And I'm not talking about biodiversity credits that offset some development somewhere else, but examples like the in perpetuity conservation agreements, which essentially you support and commit to paying farmers in perpetuity for preserving, conserving, or regenerating a particular ecosystem, be that soil, water, or sort of a biomass, such as a forest. And also having public and local advisory services that are unbiased and aren't coming from companies like Syngenta and Bayer, who are there just to sell a product to these farmers. And finally, if you're a consumer and you don't fall into those other two categories, what can you do? Now, I'm putting a big caveat here of wherever possible, because I acknowledge there are barriers to this, but wherever possible, try and buy whole food. So you're not buying from these companies that make all their money off processing food to the hilt, and ideally buy directly from farmers or small scale retailers who align with your values, and try and just avoid the supply chains that are controlled by these corporations. So, sorry, Sharon, 1 minute over, but that is all from me. And here's the paper if you're curious, and my email if you ever want to chat further. Thanks.